Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode and the next one, I'm exploring something we all do on a regular basis, but might not be as good at as we might like to think, and that is decision making. Of course, we're all capable of making decisions. You decided to listen to this show, for which thank you. But it's quite surprising when we look at the detail of what goes into a decision, and there are some things that we can learn that can help to make us better at it. My guest is Dr Melina Moleskis, who combines behavioural science and decision science to advise her clients on being better decision makers. And if you're wondering what decision science is, don't worry, we'll get to that in the episode. In our discussion, we explore why decision making isn't always the logical exercise we might like to think it is. Spoiler alert, there are some behavioural dynamics that come into play. How AI can enrich our decision-making, the risks of judging decisions by the outcome, the importance of learning from failure, why practising decision-making can help us to be better at it, and much, much more. I came across Melina on LinkedIn, where she consistently produces fascinating, insightful content, which is why I'm delighted to have her on the show. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Dr. Melina Moleskis on decision-making. Melina, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for having me.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here because you're someone that I came across on social media, and I've got to say the quality of your posts and the content you put out, you consistently amaze, surprise, delight, and above all, make me think in a really good way. And so I'm really excited to have you here. But obviously, I know who you are, but some of my listeners might not have come across you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Of course, I am Melina Moleskis. I do trainings, consult, research, teach on decision making. So I have an endless fascination in decision making. And my approach is to combine behavioral science and decision science, which I think makes for a really great combination in understanding better how ourselves make decisions, but also how those around us make decisions, which is also very important.
And what was it that got you interested in decision making? Because we all take decisions, and we take more than we actually probably recognize. But what was it that got you interested in that?
My own decisions, I not having been educated, if you like, or trained in decision making, I've often found my life, not sure of my decisions, of how to make them. Did I make a good one? Could I make a better? I didn't have like a structure or a guide about decision. I was thinking, okay, this is strange because we learn so many things at school. We learn probabilities, but not how to apply them for uncertainty. And we learn, like optimizations, but can you really optimize in life? So through a long journey, I've discovered that there's actually a relatable and scientific way to think about decisions that can help anyone guide them throughout their decisions of their lives, small to big decisions. And I thought this is amazing. Everyone should know about this. It should be in schools. It should be in corporate trainings.
It's super interesting, I think, because when we look at you talk about school, but we can look at business as well. We spend a lot of time doing things like time management, right? These sort of basic, almost very primitive things. And yet decision making is such a key element, and it's sort of assumed that we can. And we don't help people. And I think we've seen my whole focus, like, I guess if you looked at sort of human risk, is all about when things go wrong, right? The downsides of that. There is an upside or a positive thing as well, but it has such big implications. And yet we just presume that it naturally must be there. And so I think this is really interesting that you're taking something that we all intuitively understand. We're all capable of doing, right? We're all capable of making. Some people are not very good at making decisions. We're all capable of doing it. And it's not viewed as a core skill. And so I love this idea that you're just going, just hold on a minute. Let's just stop. Let's just dissect this process that we all have to go through. We're forced to make decisions on things. And let's look at why that's happening. And you mentioned behavioral science and decision. Can you just, what's the difference between those two things?
Yeah. So, decision science, broadly speaking, you have like a group of fields that, so you have economics, statistics, operational research, behavioral decision making. So you have a group of fields that gives you the structure, the steps that we all know how to follow, how to follow for a decision, the tools and then models to forecast and analyze. So you have that. And yeah, there is a behavioral element in decision science, but the thing is that compared to what we think the behavioral element is, it's actually much stronger. And what behavioral science does, if you put these two together, it amplifies it. It shows that, people actually, we decide behaviorally. All of us, irrespective of position, age, experience, a lot of the time, for a lot of the decisions we make, we decide behaviorally. So when you put behavioral science in science, you not only improve the tools that you have for making better decisions, but, as you know, you also improve the change that you want to bring in yourself or others, because we are used to making decisions a certain way. So if we're going to use better tools or, better thinking strategies, how we're going to remember, how we're going to persuade others, these things, there's a behavioral change element that without having some scientific ways of how to change yourself, get yourself there, it all stays as knowledge and not action.
And I love the way you talk about that as well. It seems to me that there's almost a courtroom logic that we sometimes look at decisions, right? If you go to court, your decisions will be scrutinized and there'll be a logic applied that will ignore things like the emotional pressures that you're under, what had happened, what is it? I mean, just the weather, right, can determine whether you're hungry or not. All of these things, these human bits of the real world that we recognize, and they're applying this theoretical. And so I love what you're talking about, because my sense of it is we can dissect decisions with the benefit of hindsight, and we can sort of reckon, was that a good decision, bad decision? And of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing because we see what happened afterwards, and therefore we can sort of, that was a terrible, well, actually, based on the information they had at the time, it might have been a brilliant decision. We can't judge it by the same standards. And so when we look at a lot of the structures we have in society, the courts being a good example, by default, there's a logic and a thought process applied that isn't necessarily valid for the real world. And so what I love about what you're doing as well is looking and saying, okay, we have to recognize there is a sort of algorithmic logic to decision making that we could look at. But we also then have to take the second bit of saying, well, how does that fuse with the realities of the human brain, the emotional drivers, the situations and environments that's there? And so you're really taking, it seems to me, something that's a theoretical, correct analysis of what's going on, and then saying, well, how does that mesh into the messy world that we all live in?
Exactly. And because, as you say, the assumption is that more or less we make rational decisions. So we have all these hardware and software issues that prevent us from sometimes not deciding rationally. But the aim is to decide rationally. I mean, because sometimes when I have these discussions, people say, but we're human. If you always decide rationally, you behave like robots. That's never going to happen. I mean, we're never going to be like fully rational. And it's not about never having a cigarette or never eating junk food but it's about weighing your actions, your decisions, aligning them with your values. If you repeatedly do these little habits, for example, where are you going to end up in a few years? So you have to think of the consequences. This is rationality, the rational consequences, not the optimistic ones that you think are never going to happen. And the same, like you say, when the stakes are bigger in a courtroom where you have to, uh, as a witness or as a juror, there are things that you have to calibrate within yourself to make sure that you make a fair decision, a fair judgment.
One of the things I think is really cool about what you do is you present, and this is particularly, and I'll put a link to your social media feed so people
Yeah.
can follow it, but is you've got a really neat way of translating complex things into stuff that's easily understandable. And I think one of the things that's really nice about what you do, and there are lots of people out there that don't do this, right? That sort of use very technical language. Oh, it's not action. You still go, that's interesting, but it's not action. What do I do with that? And so I see you're very much fulfilling a translation service of going, there's a complex process. And we think decision making is kind of easy because it comes naturally to us. And yet there is a lot of stuff going on in the machine of our brains. There's lots of things going on there, lots of factors that are being weighed up. And you then digest that and put that in simple, digestible form. And I'm fascinated by the process that you go through for doing that because when I look at what you put out there, I mean, you're dealing with some quite the underlying subject matter is quite complex, and you managed to sort of simplify it. And I wonder what the process for doing that was. Is it because you're just really passionate about this subject and you managed to kind of translate it? Did you find that challenging? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, I'm like a detective, my so
The decision
what
detective. There we go. Right.
ooh, yeah, that's nice. So the question that I want to answer for myself, first of all, is okay. What does science tell us? What's the evidence, or even if there's no evidence yet, because truth be told, there's not many experiments around. What works best in organizations, but we have theory driven suggestions. So, what does academia tell us? And that's hard because, as you can imagine, well, there are different journals dealing with decision making, different fields. So that's where the detective part comes in. So you always have to follow lead to find like the tools that um, you know they can be buried in any kind of journal. So it's a strange process, but the other part of it is, once you find the tool, you see how supported it is by research, and you see how useful it would be in general, because there's a huge gap, right, between academia and practice. And even when I was doing my PhD, I knew I didn't want to be an academic because I considered that I would be like isolated and I wouldn't be giving back as much. Even now that I'm writing some academic papers, I think, oh, who would read them? Anyway, so
That's such a great question, right?
I'm spending all this time here, and well, um, exactly. So I think I want to work within that gap. So take like complex things or like discoveries that didn't get enough light and bring them, simplify them first, with words, simple words. And how would that work for a person that they're trying to like open up their mind, for example, the inner wisdom of the crowd tool. That is good. I mean, we know what wisdom of the crowd is about, that you have when you have a group that is fulfill some condition that, they're independent, decentralized stuff. When they give you like their recommendations, on average, they could be better than expert recommendations. So what happens if you don't have, such a crowd? You can do it within your head. So you can think of what you think, like your judgment about a certain situation. So, as Melina, I think this has a 50% chance of, being a good move. But then the exercise is about thinking like, you know, another person that would disagree with you, that that they have a different perspective, they think things differently. That could be my partner, for example, because we always, we have very different ways of thinking about things. And you can think, okay, what percentage of success would that person give? Maybe it could be like 10% because you're thinking more about, no, this is not so realistic or whatever. And you take the average of the two judgments. And that's a better judgment to base your decision on than just your own. So this is a little exercise you can do. But of course, when you try it in practice, it's really hard. It's really hard to doubt yourself, you're alone and you're thinking, what am I gonna give a 50% weighting to someone who I disagree with? No way. I'm gonna go with my own judgment. So you have to come to a certain mindset to be more open and more humble, like confident humility way. So to accept someone else's opinion.
That's really interesting because I've been playing a little bit with Chat GPT for this
Yeah.
because my view, well, as I thought about exactly this point, right, which is, and of course I always make brilliant decisions, right, but occasionally, Melina, this will surprise you. Occasionally, I'll get things wrong. And what I started to realize was that I was seeking out those contrarian views, but of course that's really difficult because of your echo chamber. And I don't want to. It's difficult to hang out with people that you constantly disagree with, and so chances are there will be some level. If you look at your partner, for example, there's some level of commonality and agreement, because otherwise you wouldn't have a relationship. So they might have different. And of course, couples can still have arguments and disagreements about things, but fundamentally, you've got to agree on some basic things for the relationship to survive. And so as I looked at it, I was thinking it's quite difficult sometimes to find that person. And so for me, the interesting exploration was I can get Chat GPT, which doesn't come with any of the emotional hangups about not telling me, sugarcoating it, making it more palatable. And so I found that really interesting. Of like, give me some counter arguments to what I'm thinking. Now, of course, I rubbish it because I go, oh, it's Chat GPT. It hallucinates, and I give it kind of human attributes as to why I shouldn't listen to it. But I found that a really powerful way of doing what you achieve, because sometimes it's difficult. You don't have the human on tap that might disagree with you. And so, and
Yeah.
sometimes we really need, almost like we're going to do A, but actually there's a really strong case for B and we haven't even considered it. And we don't want someone that's
Oh,
sort of going, oh, well, maybe you want to think about B. You want a strong proponent for the opposite case that can help you deliver that. And so sometimes I found with ChatGPT, I sort of go, give me an argument against, this is what I'm planning to do. Tell me why this might be a bad idea. And it comes back with some crap. And I'm like, no, that's not good enough, right? You need to be more aggressively contrarian to see what happens. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to tap into either other human voices, because we can access these people if we go looking for them. But the technology, generative AI, can be very supportive of that process as well.
absolutely. Yes, I agree with you. It's a great use of this tool, right? And um, the way you frame it, that you ask it to like destroy your case, like find counter arguments. That's a rational approach, because what we usually do is like, okay, give me some arguments why it would be good to do this, so that I already think it's good. But give me some arguments, to be able to explain it to other people. That's what we usually do, and it's horrible.
Right.
That's how that's how I made the decision of which computer to buy. Oh, horrible decision.
Yeah, you're right. But it's funny, isn't it? Because what I find super interesting is when you start to look at what you were talking about there, is let's just take the example of buying a new computer. What am I going to naturally lean on? Well, of course, advertising is, of course, going to have effect on me, right? So I've seen advert, and then I'll read reviews, and then I'll talk to my friends who also use computers, and what do you use? And so when we think about all of those things, apart from reviews, the rest of those things are massively biased, right? Massively skewed. And of course, we're going to seek out the people that chances are. So, I'm an Apple fanboy. So it would take a heck of a lot to get me to buy something that wasn't an Apple product. So I'm already locked into that ecosystem. They've got me. But chances are I'm going to validate that decision by talking to some people who are also Apple fan people. Or if I've got somebody I'll find a reason why their choice of Windows is. And so what I think is interesting when you start to look at decisions like that, and we start to think about what are the factors that come into play, it's not great, is it? I mean, it's of course it's sensible to ask other people what they with experience of things, but we're so self-selecting in that process. And so I think when
Yeah.
you start, it's almost terrifying in a way that the awful nature of some of the factors that come into play. It's very, very primitive in some respects.
Well, I mean, the first thing is to, you start with yourself. So, well, you're anchored on Apple. I was anchored on the Lenovo ThinkPad. I had used it for years and left it. So when I wanted to buy a new one, I searched the benefits of the newer models.
Right.
So you see what I mean? I didn't, and that was my anchor. Okay, based on alternatives. So for review sites, I looked at the few. I asked a friend, but I didn't really take the recommendation because he said Apple. I said, no, no, no. I'm on ThinkPad.
Right.
It was so. when I got to the store and there was like this really nice salesperson, good at their job. So they started showing me other options. And I was completely unprepared to judge them because I hadn't considered them. But, they were saying that no, they're faster, they will last longer. And so, and they had credibility better than, my own research because I had done no research as to, find better alternatives just to check if they are better and to, calibrate myself. So I was completely unprepared. I ended up buying something that was too expensive for what it is. And I should, at the end, I should have bought maybe an apple for the price. So I completely ruined the research process. But yeah,
And
of course, it's, what you say as well that, where you get your information from, it's so important. But, first you have to start with yourself, calibrate yourself.
that was going to be a question later on, and I'll ask it now about your own decision making, because one of the things that we know from behavioral science is no matter how, we've seen, Kahneman says this quite frequently, right? Which is no matter how much you understand this stuff and know about biases and the processes, doesn't make you can't overcome them, right? Because they're so built into what we do. Has your decision making got better as you look at this stuff? And I recognize even in that, of course, the bad decisions are going to loom larger than the good ones, and you're not weighting all your decisions equally. There'll be decisions you haven't even realized you've taken. But is your gut instinct that you are getting better at this, or is it just, I don't know, maybe you're better at the bigger decisions? So the quality of your decision making, how are you perceiving that?
So that's a great question. Uh, and I see two or three questions there. So first of all, exactly what you say that, awareness is not enough. And that's why I'm going through, all the research and, books, podcasts, and talking to people. And that's what I'm trying to find, like the tools so that you don't have to rely on having a list of biases that you need to check every time. That doesn't work. So what are the tools, either personally or in a company, which is very, very important, in a group setting, group decisions? What can you do practically from today to improve your decisions without everyone knowing about the 198 biases that are out there, or, the emotions that they have to handle, the stress and everywhere? What can we do to improve? And it's never going to be perfect, but if you start applying some of these tools, it's going to be better. That's where we want to, get better. So exactly, awareness is not enough. So, okay, my decision. So what's a good decision? So there's the process element, the outcome element, which depends on how well you made the decision, but it also depends on luck. So we can never make, perfect decisions, and that's okay. But what I see myself becoming better at is definitely the process. Let's say, I mean, from the very first step, okay, what am I deciding about? Because in the past, maybe I used to like get overwhelmed by the size of the decision. But really, if you just, it's like taking a photograph. You cannot have everything in the frame. So now, I mean, you have to choose what's in there and what's out. And similarly, I mean, for this frame, what matters for you? What values? What values or objectives have a role in this? I mean, you can leave the rest of the values aside and focus on the most important one. So I've managed to like deal with the complexity and the uncertainty better. So that's something that I feel I've improved a lot, and it's so empowering, really. I mean, to get control of how you design. And I do that from, even, to practice it. I do it from medium-sized decisions and upwards, not just, the really big ones. At the same time, I think I've become a little bit, when my partner, he thinks about it, I said, no, don't think about it like that. So I've become a little bit of, what's the word in English? Nagging and, trying to correct. but just with my partner. I don't express this with other people, but I notice it. I'm noticing it more like observation, and it's the way that we learn, right? Observing. And so it's a fascinating journey personally as well, and I also I I enjoy like this conversation that we have, and people realizing like the important, you know it of course, but newer conversations with other people, realizing how important it is to like, okay, let's go back a little bit to the fundamentals, and this can have like a big impact on where we end up in the long term.
And there's a couple of things that you said that I want to pick up on, and I'll mention them both because I'll forget one of them. The
Yeah.
first one was that we can't make perfect decisions, right? And I love that idea because I think there is a that human striving for perfection. We often we want a methodology that's going to get this right every time, right? Make life simple, and we aspire to getting everything right. And I think recognizing. And the second thing I wanted to pick up on was the rehearsing, right? If we think about any other context where we're doing something, we know that we should practice it, right? And you don't want to. And I was talking to someone yesterday about job interviews, and I said, don't just go for the job interview for the one company that you want, right? Go do some job interviews where you really don't care, just so you can practice. And if you screw it up, it doesn't matter because you need, or if you wouldn't just go and run a marathon, you need to train for those things. And so I think both of those concepts, we sort of think, well, I'll reserve that for the big decisions and I'm going to get those absolutely right. I think both of those things, they're understandable desires, but I think the reality of decision making is what you portrayed. So I wonder what your thoughts were on both of those things.
um yeah, so the first one was you say outcome bias, basically that, yeah, we have the tendency to judge a decision by its outcome. I mean, even if I ask you now, think of a good decision that you made and think of a bad one. Most people, will think of how it turned out. And that's very wrong. I mean, if you think about, in organizations, who do you end up promoting? Someone who got it right this time, or someone who was lucky? If you judge the decision just by the outcomes of, that means that you need more transparency in the way that you make decisions in organizations, and more sort of what Kahneman talks about as a decision journal. But within a company, you cannot have things in your head or just one person knowing about something. You need a decision process that is somewhat registered, so that if something goes wrong, you can defend your decision for once. But also, if anyone wants to see what happened, they can, and they have like with no hindsight bias, they have a clearer process. So that's really important in organizations and also in personal life. And that's another thing that I try to do for the bigger decisions. Write down my process, which also helps me throughout the decision because I check myself. And also I come later and say, okay, this is what I did wrong, this I can improve, etc. So yeah, this is one of the fundamental things that we get wrong. I mean, we say that the quality of the decision is about the outcome, but it's not. It's really about the process. And rehearsing decisions. I love basketball. I watch a lot of if I can give an example from there. So if you see high performing teams, and you see the coaches and how angry they get if the players, if they're ahead by many points, and they start relaxing the game, so they call a timeout and they tell them, okay, no, you should do this. There's some yelling, and they try to bring them up to the level they should be playing. And it's not for that game. They've won that game, but it's for the next game and practicing and building the mindset. And that's exactly how it is with decisions as well. So, I mean, I have some people, some friends that come and, we discuss if they have a big decision and we talk about it. You see that most of them are chaotic how they think about that decision because they haven't practiced, they don't have the tools to bring it to a level where they can handle it, handle the uncertainty and everything else.
I'm smiling there because I love that idea. And I do this. I hadn't really thought about this. I love that idea if you're watching sport yes, for the drama, right? Who's going to win? Because you have to have some vested interest in the outcome. But I love this idea that you're watching the psychology of what's going on and the interaction between manager and players. I think that's super interesting. And as you were talking, I mean, I don't watch that much basketball. Maybe I should, right? I probably will now that you've recommended it. But I'm like, I do the same thing, right? I'm fascinated by, and I'm paying lots of attention to the commentator. If I'm watching on TV, commentators. But you're right, that human interaction thing is really interesting. And so using it as a, I hadn't really, I'd always thought about, maybe this is probably a bad thing, but I'd always thought about sport as a distraction, right? I'm going to watch some sport so I don't have to think about work. But actually, my subconscious. So I love this idea that you're taking that as a kind of case study for decision making, because I think that illustrates, it's people doing things in the real world, right? It's a real life situation. There is something at stake that they care about. And so you're observing humans, to use my terminology, in the wild. And I love that. I
Mm.
love that idea that it's partly your laboratory. It's not just a place you go to relax and have some fun to watch sport, but it's actually you're observing human decision making.
Well, I like you. I watch one basketball team that I'm a fan of, and I can understand basketball because I played it growing up. So it's not the same with football, for example, or any other sport. But yes, I watch it, and now I mean I can't help but also watch these things as well when I'm watching. Like the behaviors and even the comments that they make after the game, or the interviews they give. It's there are some coaches, some players that they really get it, and it's a perfect laboratory because it's transparent to some extent. It's condensed, like there's a big thing that you have to achieve, and what's the mindset and the decision that you make within the game. So yeah, I like to connect it with basketball.
And I think that's a really good illustration of your overall approach, right? Which is, yes, of course, you talk about it as a laboratory to observe, right? But there's a beautiful metaphor in there as well in the way that you articulate and communicate those things. And I think one of the things that is interesting about decisions is that often what drives decisions is, if we look at sort of defensive decision making, right? I don't want to look like an idiot, so I'm going to take a decision that will, under all circumstances, not make me look stupid. And so I've mitigated the downside, if you like, and that yes, it's sensible because you avoid embarrassment. But that idea of narrative, right? What am I going to tell other people, and what am I going to tell myself? Becomes an absolutely key part of it. We're capable of looking ahead and thinking, what is this going to look like? But that can lead us to some terrible outcomes because we're almost, it's almost like the PR bit of our brain goes, how am I going to talk my way out of this one? And and we see that everything from, oh, well, let's hire these consultants, right? They're really expensive. They're probably not going to tell us anything useful, but nobody, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM logic.
Mm,
And so I love this
mhm.
idea of perception playing a massive role in decision making.
Yeah, you touch on some great points there. Exactly, it's a system, right? I mean, you have to have an environment with certain things that need to be there so that you are allowed to make decisions that turn out badly. Because, if you hire IBM because you hired them in the past and they did a good job, and, that that is a good decision. That could be a good decision. But the outcome might be mediocre or bad, fine. But say if there's IBM, but there's another company that, a new startup that can serve you better, but you choose not to work with them and go with your previous choice because it's less risky, then okay, you might say that that is a bad decision, and the outcome will be bad. But so you, at the end of the day, what we want is that if the process is right and you can justify why you made that decision, and justifying is one of the steps, in decision making. You have to be able to explain to yourself or others. So, irrespective of the outcome, if you have like the conditions to that, you can support you and to that you can get feedback and do better next time. That's the ideal condition, which of course, realistically, it's missing, right? I mean, we don't see a lot of environments that are that can handle failure. And that's one of the biggest issues that you see. It causes so many other problems. It causes lack of accountability, responsibility, initiative. People don't want to take up on those roles because if they do something wrong, and that's one of the things that you need to improve to have a better decision making environment.
I'm always on the lookout for people that do this well, right? Environments where mistakes are supported. And I'm not talking about
Yeah.
willful, idiotic mistakes. I'm talking about stuff that didn't turn out the way we expected, but the decision making was good. Or even the decision making wasn't that good, but it's proved a valuable learning point, where they did something stupid, but actually, as a result of doing something stupid, we've learned a useful lesson. And it's super interesting because it's quite hard to find. And so
Yeah.
there's some very strange dynamics that I found where sort of if you look at places like Amazon, interestingly, I mean, we can criticize that company for lots of, but they take lots of, he places lots of bets, and some of them, the Amazon phone didn't, or the Fire phone or whatever it's called, didn't work out. But that doesn't matter because you also do Amazon Web Services that turns out to be a bigger business than the main e-commerce thing. And so, because you've got one person controlling the organization and a scale and money and all those sorts of things, he can afford loads of screw ups. And one of the reasons they're really successful is they have those screw ups and it's just part of their thing. And so my sense is, from what I have read, never worked there, is that's an environment where I'm not saying that they like mistakes or that they welcome, but it seems to be okay. And so it's really interesting. What are the drivers of that? Well, some of that's to do with corporate culture. Some of that's because they can afford to place lots of bets. He's got it to a scale, but clearly that must have been part of the DNA of growing the business. And so I find it really interesting when I look at it, because Amazon's not necessarily a company that lots of people would praise, and yet they do role model it in terms of that, from what I can see, in terms of that
Mm.
that sort of decision. But it's quite rare. We see lots of examples of people being fired for making mistakes or getting things wrong, and very short-term thinking and all those sorts of things. So I find it quite challenging to find examples beyond that of where this is done really, really well. And of
Yeah.
course, the challenge is everybody is, well, we're not Amazon, right? So very useful story, but not desperately helpful for us. Is that your perception as well? That this is like, we get the theory of what you've said makes perfect sense, but actually finding people that in practice are prepared to take that risk, it's quite hard.
The way I think about it, it's we can all afford a degree of screw ups. If we're not Amazon, it will be like tiny, or very small, but we can all afford that. And Amazon has been having like this mentality for decades now. So it's created this superb culture. Perhaps even Google with their graveyard, you know, they leave some slack time to employees, and then there's even a website with killed by Google, and the projects that they failed or that they're gonna fail, and without having insight, knowledge. But I suppose the way that they do that is that if by this time we don't achieve X, we're shutting the project down. So this kill criteria. So in this way, we can all screw up if we set the right kill criteria that don't derail us too much. But we don't. Uh, we it's like it's sunk cost bias, right? I mean, we start a project and then we keep investing, and then it's a big failure, and then you get fired, whatever. But uh, we don't plan ahead in that sense. But if more companies did that and they let that small space and time for the idea to grow, and controlled it with the kill criteria that they said from before, that would create, I think, a better, failure culture. I was listening to Jennifer Lerner. She's a professor at Harvard, and she works directly with decision making and executives. And she said, she gave an example of some biotechnology firms that they even did failure parties. So even when the project when time passed and a project didn't reach its goal and they had to shut it down, they partied.
Right.
And that's great because it celebrates the fact that they caught the failure early. So the data guys, well done. You guys, when we didn't waste any more resources. And, I think it also gives closure so that you can move on to the next thing. And that's all right.
I love
Uh,
that. And you reminded me of something. So in my book, I wrote about a thing at British Airways, right, where they had this idea of mistake of the month. And so
yeah.
this is and I write as I write in the business for people that haven't come across this. So this idea is in the staff magazine where you would expect to see corporate propaganda, new routes, uniforms, whatever, this is clients, whatever. They had this thing called Mistake of the Month, which was a column where people would talk about things they'd screwed up. And I thought this was brilliant for two reasons. One was it's the focus on it. But two, you're putting it in a space where you wouldn't expect to see it. So it's not like a risk update or something, right? It's in a place where they're using valuable real estate in this staff magazine to communicate something that's important. And what's the best way to get people to be honest about making mistakes and whatever is to tell stories. And so I loved all the logic. And I posted about this recently in a sort of book promo post on LinkedIn. And Alex Cruz, who was the CEO, I tagged him in it, never thinking in a million years that he'd respond. And he responded by saying, "Thank you for highlighting this. I'm glad you liked it. But actually, we had to remove it because nobody wanted to participate, right? Nobody wanted to come forward." And he said, "We had tons of excuses like, I don't want to embarrass myself, or this isn't helpful. This is." And so he was kind of going, "I tried it, but it didn't work." And so there was an irony in the failure that it was an experiment that failed. But what I thought was really interesting was I thought the idea was really good. And I think the fact that you can't make it work because people don't want to participate is a really powerful indicator that there's a much bigger problem than the one you thought you've got, right? Which is, and you need to deal with that. And he wasn't kept around for long enough, I think, to resolve that. But I thought it was super interesting because I'd gone, oh, well, here's an example of people do this well, and actually it failed. And he wasn't, I'm pretty sure that if you've got the initiative to launch that sort of thing, then you're going to want to pursue. That's part of who you are. He just wasn't allowed to be around for long enough. And so I think it's super interesting when you talk about the idea of celebrate a party for a failure seems weird because we celebrate success. Sharing mistakes seems like a weird. Why would you do that? And I love this because this is all counterintuitive stuff. And so what this points towards, back to the whole thing, is that the way we try and resolve something, sometimes we need to use illogical methods, right? It seems weird to have a party for something that's gone wrong. It seems weird to want to talk about screw ups. But actually, if we want to make better decisions, what I think all this stuff points towards is we have to try some things that are counterintuitive. We have to experiment in that space to work out how we do that. And that's not logical. And so to get the behavioral change we're looking for may require us to do counterintuitive things.
Mm. And things that catch people's attention, right? Like, exactly, they're counterintuitive. But I can see that's a great example that you offer with British Airways. And I can see why it's, uh, in such an established organization, it's much more difficult um, to get things, from one day to the next to change how people operate within the workspace. So it's probably much easier than, if for young, biotechnology dynamic firms that, it's more expected also within that field, that industry. But exactly, borrowing examples from there, counterintuitive examples, may be a good idea to shake things up in more established companies.
And that's got me thinking, actually. It's interesting about the longer processes have been running. And I see this in the compliance space that I work with. It's like, this is the way we've always done things. And if the only justification you've got is that's the way we've always done things, that is a terrible basis on which to decide. You need to justify it on its own terms because it might have made sense ages ago. It might not have done. But the only way we've had progress in life is to question and challenge some of these particular things. And so as you were talking, I mean, it strikes me that if you're looking at decision-making processes that have been going on for a long time, methodologies have been deployed for centuries or whatever, then that's going to be much harder to shift because of that legacy. It's the way we do things around here. It's our culture. Much harder to shift than a newer organization. So I guess to your point is if you're making this as an individuals, if we're making decisions that if we're just taking a decision that we've previously taken, we're more likely to be an autopilot. So is it the case that we can make better decisions if there's less history of that? Because there's an interesting tension here between I've got experience, so I know what I'm doing, but experience can also be dangerous. Is there any patterns that we
Yeah.
can see in that are helpful?
But it's definitely more challenging to teach adults. There's a degree of unlearning that needs to happen, not just in ourselves, but within the group. And, as an example, um, let's say you're trying to manage the risk of a project. So before you decide, you ask your team, okay, what could go wrong? What could go wrong with it versus using the pre-mortem exercise, which is, imagining a year has passed
Right.
and then you try to think why the project failed. So two different questions aiming at the same thing. But if you ask the second one, we know from research that this prospective hindsight frees up the brain to come up with more scenarios. You get 30% more coverage of the what can go wrong. Plus, people feel more freer to talk about what can go wrong. So, but okay, how are you gonna remember to do that? That's I mean. That's a realistic issue. So exactly, it's not just about. First is knowing some tools, like some simple tools you could use, and then you have to spend time to think what can get in your way of applying this tomorrow. It's a habitual thing. You might not remember it. You might forget what the process is to do the pre-order. It's a very simple process, but you might, you forget. You have so many things in your mind. And then you have to convince your colleagues that this is a better way to do it. So if you make some space, some time for you to figure out how to overcome these obstacles, like maybe, have a little template that lays down the steps and the advantage so that you can communicate to others. Um, Write a checklist of the process that you want to follow, when making such decisions, and include this pre-mortem. If you find the time to overcome these obstacles, which, they're small, but when you put them on top of the other within a realistic environment, it's a matter of doing it or not. So when you learn about something, you have to figure out how you're going to implement it as well and have the answers ready so that you can. That's what we get from behavioral science, right? So that, knowing something doesn't mean that you're going to do it. It has to be easy, essentially. So you have to make it easy for yourself.
That's really interesting because what you're putting decision making, and of course these things are interrelated, but you're putting decision making in the way the process into the same bucket as we would think about things like dieting or exercise regimes or anything else, right? We
Yeah,
have to
yeah, it's
plug it
changing a lot.
into our
Yeah.
processes because the theory of what I ought to do, right? I ought to count my calories. I ought to do a certain amount of exercise, whatever it is, right? That's theoretical. How do I practically do that? Well, I need techniques that will sit within the natural flow, and I've got to learn that new habit. And so, almost, I think what you're talking about, and I love that example of the pre-mortem. Everybody understands it. It's classic business school stuff, right? Let's teach you about pre-mortem. This is a good way to do it. And it's all very sensible advice, a little bit like eat more vegetables, right? Sensible advice. But if you don't plug that into a process, the humans at the end of it aren't going to adapt to it. And so I really like this idea of you saying, okay, decision making, there are some things that we can do, right? Some techniques we can deploy, some processes, but we got to work out the human aspect of that. How do we plug this in? Because people forget. People might ignore it. People, if it's difficult, whatever. So we have to plug it into the natural flow of things. And I guess that's the point, really, isn't it? Is between the decision science and the behavioral science. The decision science will say, "I'll tell you the theory of how we get this done. These are the processes that we would need." And it's the behavioral science is about saying, "Well, how do we actually employ that?" So just because it's theoretically the right thing to do doesn't mean the humans at the end of this will do it. So you're fusing both of those things and making it actionable.
Yes, behavioral science has a big part to play in the implementation, the actionable part. Also in the content part, the tools that you use. But yes, in this case, it's very much about the actionable part. And some of those obstacles, uh, they cannot be solved easily, right? The thing about the example that you gave about British Airways, there's a bigger issue there. And it's a system, to be honest. I mean, it's not up to the individual to remember, it's a system. But if you don't recognize the obstacles, if you don't bring them up to surface and you overcome the ones that are easy to overcome and make some kind of plan to work on the other one, then you cannot bring this whole thing together. Uh, and that's how culture changes, right? Culture is about the collection of habits and behaviors. And if we're talking about changing the bigger things like the way things are done, the culture, what people do when no one is looking, you have to start from smaller behaviors. There's an impact that can be achieved at the individual level. And if you bring it more systemically, if you can have some systems, some processes, like what we're saying about, okay, let's have this thing where decisions need to be, we need to register in a more systematic way how we get to decisions. And let's have some checklists in place for the new guys who come to the office so that they know what to do. Or here's a checklist of how we run meetings around here, how we do brainstorming, how we challenge people, how we offer challenge and how we invite challenge. You know what? Let's have these things out in the open so that we can practice them more. And so it's a huge, huge issue, but we can always improve starting also from the individual level, which is where I start basically. But, recognizing that it's a systemic thing, I also try to look at the bigger factors.
And I love as you were talking about documenting how we make decisions, my mind went to like minutes of meetings, right? The record of decision making. And we all know, if you've been to any kind of corporate meetings, we all know those are not that they're sort of just confected discussions. Sometimes because the decision's actually been taken in the room outside, right, before the meeting's even taken place. And even the account of it's a sort of fictional narrative of what happened. It doesn't capture always the detail. If there are unpleasant arguments made, they're often not written down. We have a sort of clean narrative. And that applies particularly in the world I'm in, where you've got regulators looking at firms. There are lots of times where regulators go, we want to see the board minutes of the decisions. And it's totally performative nonsense. And if even if I look at my own company, right, there's a company of one, I have board minutes where things are decided, right, because I have to have those structures. And so, they won't surprise anyone that my company secretary, which is my accountant does this stuff for me, writes all these things out, right? And we have these minutes of meetings that actually never took place, but we need to have them. It's not a serious thing, right? Because I am making these sorts of decisions, but there's a record there that doesn't reflect the realities that was there. And so as you were talking about documenting, I thought that was super interesting because often if you were to look at the paperwork around decisions, and that might be the press release, that might be the investor pitch or the minutes or any of these sorts of things, it's large swathes of it is fictional. I mean, I won't go as far as saying BS, but in many cases that's true. And I don't mean behavioral science, right? And I think it's really interesting that you're talking about documenting the reality, right? And in some cases, that might be how we would like it to be. So again, there's not a total truth there, but I think that's interesting because the only times we talk about meetings and processes and decisions is in documents that are there for a different purpose. They're there to sort of demonstrate things. And so it's not realistic. It's not realistic of what actually happens. And so I love this idea of you're kind of going, okay, we get the formal document thing, but let's just have a look behind the scenes, right? This is the mechanics of it. This is how it actually needs to work. And that's not often documented, right? You have to pick that up by the way we do things around it. You go and observe and you work it out for yourself. So I love this idea of saying, if we want to get better decision making, we need to not have the only record of meetings and discussions to be some fabricated, confected document that may serve a different purpose, but actually look at really what happens, not what we'd like to have happen or what theoretically happen, but actually how does it happen? And let's talk about those mechanics.
Yeah, exactly. And it also means that, the tools that you use, the 2x2, like tables that you use to present the information as you gather it. Let's say you have to select between different companies to partner with. And you have this criteria and you have these options. It's your companies, you do a table. and you try to present them on the table there. Uh, that's a good way, I mean, to show, the information that goes into making that decision. You can even improve it better by using something like a traffic lights grid. So, they do it at the Meta. So each cell, then they color it either green, yellow, or red, depending on how easy it is to do. So, or, how feasible, exactly, how realistic. So if partner A, I mean, they're asking for, too large a part of the pie, and it's not, so we are red there. So we can see from the table that, if one row has too many reds, then it's not really realistic or feasible. Let's move to the other option. So these kind of ways to demonstrate and to communicate the information that you've gathered as an analyst to other people who are going to make the decisions are really useful. And these kind of things, if you have them, like most companies don't do this, but if you did this, how easy would it be for someone to take this table and, okay, see more or less how the decision was made without, having to rely on faulty memory and the accounts from different people?
I love that. I think it comes back to that point about there's no such thing as a perfect decision, and we can easily delude ourselves. We want to say we've made the best possible decision here, but actually there's going to be there's downsides to every decision. And there isn't this sort of like one thing is the absolute perfect thing. Sometimes that'll be the case, but very rarely. Most of the time there is a downside, an unintended consequence. And it's interesting, I see this in my world where you get somebody rolls out a policy or a training program and it always gets rolled out as like we have done this, job done. And I'm like, you don't know for sure that your policy is going to do what's right. You don't know that your training is going to hit the spot until it lands in the real world. And so what we should be doing is recognizing that it's not what we're putting out there as an experiment, is an attempt to influence people's things, is a process that we're trying something. And so I always say to people, you should disclose the potential downsides, right? So it's not acceptable to say there are no downsides. What's the worst thing that could happen if everything goes wrong off the back of your decision? And let's disclose that up front so we're looking at it. And so I like this idea of what you were talking about, the process, saying how feasible is it? So that if we decide, we could say this is going to be really hard, right? There's a ton of reasons why this might not work out, but we still want to do it. But at least we've set the scene saying this is a little bit of a gamble, right? And what we don't do is bet the entire company on this one thing, but we might say for a very small number of our decisions, we'll take a big risk, right? Like an
Yep.
investment portfolio would be. And so I
Yep.
like that idea of forcing honesty because I think that if I looked at all the things you've talked about here, it is about let's not have nonsense sort of, like we have made the best decision on the best available information, and there are no downsides, and that we're brilliant. The sort of language Donald Trump would use to talk about his own decision making, the best decisions always winning, but all that kind of stuff, right? Is being
And,
realistic
and
about it.
it's the language that we read a lot, right? About, you know, the hard part. Okay, this is the best, or silly, but it's not realistic.
Love that.
Uh,
As I knew would happen, Melina, we've time has just raced away from us. But before I let you go, tell my listeners a little bit. What sort of projects do you work on? So if people are interested in obviously they can read your ideas on social media, and I'll encourage them to do that and put links to those things. But like, if people want to, they're intrigued by what you do, want to work with you, what sort of things do you do?
so I do corporate trainings for different needs around decision making, and it's usually paired with uh, challenges organizations have, like more productive meetings is one, which of course, okay, there's the meetings etiquette, but there's the group decision making that takes place there. So we take the challenges organizations have and we go deeper into it with the respect of from the side of decision making. I also like consult and do hands-on work on specific problems. From at the moment, I'm working with the Cyprus government and helping them bring behavioral science into some of to solve some of the issues they're having, like low absorption rates of the funding schemes that they have, poor communication of the funding schemes and things like that. So yeah, we're doing that. And I teach about decision making, behavioral economics, which is It ties a lot with everything because it also, I think teaching is the best teacher for oneself as well.
Yes.
So you can get really deep into what you're doing. That's it. These are my three areas,
Love it.
basically.
Love it. Like, that's it. That's amazing. And I think one of the things that's really cool is that we've heard this thing is when I look at your output, the way you talk about it, right? That's the best showcase for how you go about teaching and engaging with people. And so I think you've given us, I love the fact that you kind of give this stuff. And if I look at what you give away on social media, if that's what you get for free, imagine what you get if you pay for it. It's amazing stuff. So I want to say a big thank you to you for all the stuff that you put out there. As I said at the beginning, it's always thought provoking and interesting and engaging. But above all now, thank you so much for being a great guest on the show. I've really enjoyed the time. I know you and I are going to have more conversations and do fascinating things together. So I look forward to that. But thank you so much for being a great guest on the show.
Thank you so much, Christiane. I'd love that. Yeah. All the best. Bye bye.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk podcast. My enormous thanks to Melina for appearing and to you for listening. If you enjoyed that episode, then do check out the next one where I'll be speaking with decision-making expert Ben Cattaneo. It's the perfect match for what you've just heard. To find out more about Melina, her work, and her newsletter, which I highly recommend subscribing to, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. As I said at the outset, the next episode of the show is also about decision-making, so do join me and decision-making expert Ben Cattaneo for that. But in the meantime, stay safe, keep making great decisions, and thank you so much for listening.